You disintegrated Einstein.
Calm down, Marty. I didn't disintegrate anything. The molecular structure of both Einstein and the car are completely intact.
Where the hell are they?
They have gone back to basics.
Nothing like a smooth start, hey. Hey, we are into week 2 of our series called Back to Basics. And Pete Collison spoke last week as he introduced the series when he talked about faith having a PR problem. And I loved one of the statements which he said during his talk last week. If you weren't here, you can catch up online via our website if you want to. Pete said this. He said, faith is not just about believing in God, but also about believing God. You know, there are so many people today who might well say that they believe in God, but believing in God makes absolutely no difference to their lives at all. God's like this insurance policy that they have. So if life gets difficult, well, at least they've got someone to call on, and hopefully he'll be able to sort it out for them. But faith, real faith, is so much more than just believing in God. Let me illustrate. There was a little French boy. His name was Jean-Francois Gravelet. He was born 200 years ago in 1824. And he, as a young boy, had this amazing ability to be able to do kind of acrobatics. And he had this incredible sense of balance. And so at the age of 5 years old, he went off to a place called Lyon in France, where he went to the school for gymnasts. And basically, he learnt to develop his arts and skills in that way. In 1855, this now man, whose name had changed to Charles Blondin, mainly because when he was a little boy, he had very blonde hair. And he made his way to America, where he went to join a kind of an exhibition run with doing gymnastics along with kind of horse riding and that kind of stuff. But while he was there, he visited the Niagara Falls, and he decided that he wanted to do a tightrope walk from the American side over to the Canadian side. So he got hold of this 2-inch rope made of hemp, and it was stretched 1,300 feet from the American side, attached to a tree, going across to the other side, to the Canadian side. Above, it was about 160 feet above the kind of raging waters underneath. And Blondin had announced that he was going to do this tightrope walk in June of that year. And so when it came to the day, people turned up in their thousands to see this man Blondin have a go at making this tightrope walk across the Niagara Falls. And so when it came to the day, there were about 25,000 people. That's what's been reported, 25,000 people, some on the American side, some on the Canadian side, to watch this feat, kind of wondering, was he going to be able to make it or not? And so Charles Blondin stepped onto the rope from the American side, and he started to make his way across. There was such jeopardy in what he was doing because there was no net underneath. If he fell, he was going to fall to his death. He said that if you prepare for failure, you're more likely to fail. And so he never, ever did a tightrope walk with a net underneath in case of saving him. So for 23 minutes, Blondin made his way across the Niagara Falls on a 2-inch piece of hemp rope. And when he got to the other side, the cheering, just the crowd were ecstatic. They were cheering and chanting. And after about 20 minutes, of course, he was on the wrong side. So how do you get back? Well, you walk back again. And so sure enough, he did that, and he made his way back to the American side. And people loved it. they absolutely loved it. There was this sense of tension and risk about it, which they were so keen to be following. And so he promised that on the 4th of July, he would come back and do similar things again. But this time, it was extraordinary. He did somersaults across the Niagara Falls on this 2-inch rope. And he went backwards and forwards, and the crowd were just going wild. One of the times he picked his manager up, he put his manager on his back, and then he started to make his way across to the other side. Various stories are told of Blondin and these kind of amazing feats that he was doing. One of them was that he got a wheelbarrow. And he put a wheelbarrow on the rope, and he made his way across holding a wheelbarrow. And then came the crucial time, because he looked out at the crowds on the side where he was standing, and he said, how many of you believe that I could take someone across in the wheelbarrow? And everyone shouted, we believe, come on. And then he said, and who's going to get in? And nobody moved until one lady made her way to the front and offered herself to be able to sit into the wheelbarrow. And to shrieks of joy, he made his way across on a 2-inch rope, 1,300 feet, remember 160 feet above Niagara Falls. And this lady sat in the wheelbarrow and was safely taken to the other side. I tell you that story because if you just think about it, how many people had faith that Blondin could do it? Well, probably everyone who was there. But how many people really demonstrated faith? One person. One person intentionally demonstrated trust in Blondin by getting into the wheelbarrow. She truly trusted him. Now, I tell you that story because a man called James, the half-brother of Jesus, once wrote these words. He said this, do you believe that there is only one God? He says, well, that's good. He says, do you know what? The demons also believe, and they tremble with fear. In other words, he's saying just to believe that God might exist, that God might be out there, that's not enough. He says, you fool, do you want to be shown that faith without actions is useless? To shout, Blondin, we believe you can do it, but not be prepared to get into the wheelbarrow means that their faith isn't worth anything. So Pete was right last week when he said this. Faith is not just about believing in God, but also about believing God. Believing that what he says is true and right, and what he says is best for your life and for mine. So that was a quick recap on last week. This week, I want to focus on part 2 of this series, which is to focus on the problem that affects us all and asks the question of where did it all go wrong? Anyone here love movies? Yeah, okay. How many people can watch a movie more than once? Okay, that's quite a number. Well, I can do that. If it's a good movie, I can watch it over and over again, mainly because I fall asleep halfway through in it and then kind of wake up and think, I better watch that one again. But films like Back to the Future, not Back to the Future 2 and 3 and others, no, but the first film, oh boy, what a classic. I watched that just during COVID. Sarah and I went with someone else and we drove to Colchester to watch it in the car on a big screen during COVID. Fantastic. I love that movie. Other movies, Shawshank Redemption, can't beat it. Yes, that's right. Hot Fuzz. Bring it on, I tell you, that is so good. Yeah, there's a little Australian film called The Dish, which I've watched, I don't know how many times, 10 or more times. I love it. But there is another film, which was the first $1 billion film, as in the money that was made from it. And it starred Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet. Celine Dion sang her little song. What's the movie? There it is. Titanic, a classic film that goes on and on and on and on, doesn't it? But it's got a really kind of chilling, so although it's a kind of a romantic story between those two there, it's actually a really chilling story. And it's a story of contrast too. See, for those who were on the upper decks of the Titanic, there was amazing luxury, there was opulence, there was riches. And for those that weren't as wealthy on the lower decks, well, it's a different story. These were the lower classes, and that's where they slept. And of course, there was no wealth, there was no finery on the lower decks. And we all know that just a few days into the trip of the Titanic, having left Belfast, of course, it hits the iceberg. And everyone in the lower decks knows very soon that something bad has happened. And yet everyone on the upper decks are totally oblivious to the problems. You watch the film again and you'll see it. Everything looks amazing to them, and they carry on as before, eating, drinking, and dancing. But down below, in the decks below, it's a different story. Water is pouring in. And if you haven't seen the film, this is such a spoiler, but my life, you've been missing out if you don't know what happens in the end. Near the end of the film, the water rises up and it reaches the top decks. The boat splits in half, and both parts of the boat sink into the icy water, and over 1,500 people die. Now, why do I tell you that story? It's because, in a sense, it's like a metaphor for our lives. The upper deck of our lives, as such, can often look great. If you go onto social media, we can see smiling faces, we can see happy families, we can see proud parents, we can see a life full of fun, we can see some great achievements, and we put ourselves forward as competent and as capable people, because that's the image that we want people to see. And yet, in the kind of the lower decks of our lives, there's a whole load of bad stuff that's going on. So, on the top, we look content, we look successful, we look happy, but privately, below the surface, we're having suicidal thoughts. We're struggling with being addicted to alcohol or shopping or pornography or online gambling. And maybe we're struggling in our relationships, or our marriages are drifting apart, or friendships are falling apart. And we feel full of shame and guilt or anger. And to everyone else, hey, we look fine, we look good. In fact, we can look great. But below the surface, the icy waters are rising, and it's frightening. And we think, how and why does that happen? When did the iceberg hit? When did it all go wrong? Well, I can't say for you when you realized that it all started to go wrong. But I know when it all started to go wrong in the big story of humanity. Right at the start of Genesis, the first book of 66 books that makes up what we would know as the Bible, the writer gives an account of where it all goes wrong. When the iceberg hits, as such. Genesis 1, God creates our universe, and it's written as a poem. And there's this little repeating kind of phrase that comes up within this poem that says, and he saw that it was good. And as you go through the creation story, it then comes to when God made people, and all of a sudden, just the poem slightly changes. That little phrase is no longer, and he saw that it was good. This time it says that he saw that it was very good. Because people, as in you and I, are the pinnacle of his creation. What he wants is that intimacy of relationship. And so in Genesis 2, you see that being worked out. Adam and Eve are there in the garden, and they are walking in the coolness of the day, and God draws alongside them, and they have this I think, a beautiful relationship where there is no shame, there is no guilt, there is nothing to hide. They are just in an amazing relationship with each other and with God. And then chapter 3 arrives of Genesis. And that's where the beauty gets smashed. It gets spoiled. It gets wrecked on the iceberg of broken faith. God had given everything to Adam and Eve for them to be able to enjoy, but he just brought one restriction. He said, there is one tree that I don't want you to eat the fruit of. And this is how the account is written. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God really say you mustn't eat from any tree in the garden? Now, I recognize that if you're new to church, that is the weirdest verse to start with. Talking snakes. All right, yeah, I get that. I understand that. But what I want to ask you to do is just for the moment, just to leave that to one side and to have a look at what the key point of this account is. Because do you see what was happening? What was happening here? That he's trying to deceive, to cause doubt and question what God says. He says they can't eat from any tree. Well, God never said that. But already he's starting to kind of twist the truth. The woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat from the tree that's in the middle of the garden. You mustn't touch it or you will die. So she's added a little bit now. Mustn't touch it. Where did that one come from? He goes on to say this, you will certainly not die, the serpent said to the woman. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so straight away, he taps into their desires, their ego. You can be like God. You don't need God to do that. No. Now, you can work this out yourselves. And he gets them to question what God says. I was flicking through Facebook yesterday morning, and I just came across this quote, and I thought, wow, amazing. Did they know that I was giving this talk? This is what it said. The enemy didn't tempt Adam and Eve to murder, steal, or even tell a lie. He tempted them to question the words of God. And just know his tactics haven't changed. That is so true. The tactics used today is still to question God and what he says. So that little voice in us says, go on, buy it. You do it. You say it. Go on, you take it. You watch it. It won't do any harm. I mean, if God didn't mean you to do it, why would he put that desire in you to start with? And anyway, if it is wrong, he'll forgive you. So you go ahead. You won't lose out. You'll only gain from it. So when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. So it moves from being tempted to giving into that temptation and doing exactly what God had said they shouldn't do. And this is the result. Then the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. As soon as they realized what they had done, as soon as the impact of their disobedience kind of hit them, they felt guilt, they felt shame, and they covered themselves. Suddenly, they felt exposed, they felt vulnerable, and so they covered up. And of course, we've been doing that ever since. And I don't mean just covering up with clothes. We cover up and hide behind our happy social media posts, our fake smiles, our fragile confidence, our successes. We know how to hide and to keep secret that deeper, darker part of our lives. We don't want others to know. So when God came into the garden to walk with Adam and Eve, they hid. They were too embarrassed. They tried to stay away, and God calls out, where are you? And he knows exactly where they are, and he knows exactly what they've done. And eventually they speak up, Do they say sorry? Not at all. They go into what every child in a primary school does. They blame someone else. They do. If you listen to a primary school and one of the children is told off, it wasn't my fault, it was them. They do it all the time. This is exactly what was played out in the Garden of Eden all those years ago. So Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the snake, and the snake didn't have a leg to stand on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, he's so old, I'm sorry. So sin, or this choice of no longer believing God, entered our world, and the results have been devastating ever since. Titanic, in fact. Ever since, people have struggled to believe God, to believe that what he says is right and true and is best for us. And so we have this battle that goes on in our lives between what's right and wrong, of being tempted to do wrong. You recognize this, yes? The New Testament writers called it our sinful nature. In other words, we're born with that. There's this bias in us that always seems to pull us away from following God and towards just what we want. This last summer, Sarah and I had the chance to go and see our daughter Rachel and her husband Theo out on the Gold Coast in Australia. And literally just around the corner from where they live are all of these bowls courts. There are loads of them. They hold world championships there. It was quite amazing. And so we decided that we would go and play bowls. And so many of you, if I can just pick this up, many of you will recognize this. This is a bowl. And the whole idea of the game is to be able to roll the ball so that it finishes as close to the jack, the little white ball, as possible. And the distance is probably from me to the back of the hall here. And so we had a go playing those games. I'll tell you, it was so much fun. I went into an 8-1 lead against my daughter and my wife. I was loving it. It did get quite competitive. I don't know if you can just see here, but this was us measuring just to see who was the closest and who got the points. And yes, that's right. I'm embarrassed to say that I did give them a little chance, and the actual result finished as yes. Very disappointing that. It was a painful smile, that one. But these are not just regular balls. These are bowls, and bowls have a weighted side so that when you roll it, it doesn't go straight. It will always, always, always go towards the side which has the weight in it, which is this side here. I tried it just on the floor earlier to make sure that it still worked, and it does. There is a bias to it. And it's really important that you get that bias right, because I joined someone else's game at one point. I thought it was going to go that way, and it went that way. It was very, very embarrassing. They operate with a bias. You and I operate with a bias. When do we need to teach our kids how to throw a tantrum? I tell you, they are so good at that. Normally in the supermarket when it's just the most embarrassing time ever and they haven't got their way. Because there is this bias for I want what I want, and we fight for it. So we have to teach our kids to be kind, to be generous, to share. So you see, when sin entered the world, it was the iceberg-hitting moment that affects every one of us, whether we're aware of it or whether we're oblivious to it. And sin, as I've said before, if you were here just a few weeks ago, sin, the actual word sin, means to miss the mark. It does. But actually, sin in this context also means this. Sin is not believing God. It's not trusting God. And not trusting that what he says about who we are and how we should live, not trusting that he's true and right and he has the best for us. And we all know what it is to sin, but we also all know what it is to be sinned against. We know the pain it causes, the destruction of relationships, the breakdown that takes place. So let me ask you a question. Have you been cheated on? If so, you'll hate sin. Have you been abused? You'll hate sin. Have you been stolen from? Have you been beaten up? Have you been lied to? Have you been falsely accused? If you've experienced any of those things, you will know the damage that sin does, and you will hate sin. So sin is no small thing. God hates it. He hates the lack of trust and the damage that ignoring his word causes. I mean, how many of you here are parents? Just put your hands out if you're a parent. Okay, that's quite a lot of you. Okay, well, imagine being a parent and watching your child completely ignore you, actively go against what you've said, and ending up in a mess, but also ending up hurting many other people. As a parent, it will hurt you so much. You still love them, but you hate the decisions they've made and the mess that they're making of their lives. Why? Because it is so wasted. All of us here are in the same boat. We all sin. We've all been sinned against. We've all been affected by the iceberg moment when Adam and Eve rebelled against God. We all struggle with this bias, this sinful nature. And it doesn't mean that we don't do good. Of course we do good. But the battle we face is over this old nature, this sinful nature that's inside of us. So I really identify with a man called Paul, who wrote many of the letters of the New Testament, as he explained his own battle in this way. He says this: I don't understand what I do. For I don't do what I would like to do, but instead I do what I hate. Anyone recognize that? For even though the desire to do good is in me, I'm not able to do it. I don't do the good I want to do. Instead, I do the evil that I don't want to do. There's a lot of to-dos in this, okay? And if I do what I don't want to do, this means that I'm no longer the one who does it. Instead, it's the sin that lives in me. In other words, it's that bias, it's that old sinful nature that's in each of us. And Paul concludes this little section by just saying this. He says, oh boy, what a miserable person I am. He says, who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Who's going to rescue me from the iceberg hit that means that the boat is sinking? Listen, this could be the most depressing talk I've ever given at the Forge here. We're all sinners. We've all sinned. There's a bias towards sin. It's our sinful nature. So you and I are trapped. We can't just change ourselves. And we do what we don't want to do, and we don't do what we do want to do. And there we go. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next week, all right? Now, but Paul, fortunately, doesn't finish there. He goes on to say this. He says, thank God. Thank God. The answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. This is the good news, the amazing news, the most life-giving news ever. Have you heard the word gospel? The gospel basically means good news. And so instead of staying on a ship that's going down, we get airlifted out. We get rescued. In fact, we get what this word here is, what we've sung about already this morning. We get saved. By our good works, because we try to do really well? Not at all. The answer lies in someone else saving us, Jesus. But the interesting thing is that it still requires involvement from us. Because Paul puts it this way. He says this. He says, God saved you by his grace. That word grace is charis. And it means the undeserved favor, an unearned gift, a favor or blessing bestowed as a gift, freely and never as merit for work performed. It is totally given freely without being deserved in any way. It's why John Newton, the slave trader, who when he encountered Jesus, he had his life turned around. He understood what his sin had done. And he wrote these words, amazing grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, couldn't see it. I was oblivious to it, but now I see. He knew the damage that sin had done and was doing in his life, and he knew the freedom that Christ brought. Sin is no small thing, but grace is bigger. If you feel trapped, if you feel that life is a bit hopeless, you will discover in God a grace that goes beyond what we can imagine. Grace is like an ocean. It's so vast, it's so expansive, it's so deep, it's so wide, it's so refreshing, it's so wonderful, so beautiful, so full of life. God saved you, Paul said, by his grace when you believed. Remember, going back, it's not just about believing in God, it's actually believing God. God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for it. It's a gift from God. His part, my part, your part, for Paul that is to believe, to have faith in Jesus. Not just to believe that he existed. That makes little difference. To believe him, to believe that he's dealt with the power of sin. To believe that his forgiveness is real. And to accept the free gift of undeserved grace. Paul writes this, he says, salvation is not a reward for the good things that we've done, so none of us can boast about it. So please forget this little phrase, I'm a good person claim. Your actions might look good on the top deck, but deep down you know the struggle you have with sin. To believe God and to act on what he says. And then Paul goes to my favorite verse. This is, I often bring this one up because it is so good. He says this, for we are God's masterpiece. Remember, that goes right back to creation, that God said it was very good. We are God's masterpiece. He's created us anew in Christ Jesus. So in other words, that old sinful nature no longer has to dominate our lives anymore because he's created us anew, so that we can do the good things that he planned for long ago. Good works are not the way to be saved. Good works are not the way just to try and win ourselves to God. They're not. But they are the outworking of being saved. It's faith in action. Hey, we are a right mixed bag. We're a bit like our world. There are parts of the world which are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Did anyone see the aurora borealis just the other day? When you look up into the night sky, you put your camera up there and you see the colors. It is glorious. It is beautiful. Our world is beautiful. And then you look at Gaza and you think our world is horrendous. And our lives reflect our world. There are some things we do which are beautiful. Some relationships that we have which are so close. And yet also within us there is that sinful nature which can so often cause destruction, not just for ourselves, but for others. But the great thing is, in God's story, there is beauty on the horizon. We are his portion, and he is our prize. Drawn to redemption by the grace in his eyes. If his grace is an ocean, we're all sinking. I love that. If his grace is an ocean, we're all sinking. His grace can incorporate every single one of us, no matter. And heaven meets earth like an unforeseen kiss, and my heart turns violently inside of my chest, and I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way that he loves me. That is undeserved grace. That's what he lavishes on you and me, despite our failures. So let's stand and let's sing about the God who loves us.